I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Have you ever wondered what true institutional panic looks like when it is completely silent? It looks like a senior aide standing in the Windsor corridor, holding a revised residential map that Prince William just approved behind closed doors. Camilla's staff saw it first, and the realization hit them immediately. They were no longer managing a royal home, they were packing one up. The moment Catherine stood beside her husband to confirm the shift, it became undeniable that the old guard had just been outmaneuvered without a single raised voice. The order came down quietly, the way everything real inside the palace always comes down. No cameras were rolling, no press officer stepped in front of the microphones. There was no dramatic eviction, no shouting match at the gates, no furniture being dragged across the great stone floors of Windsor. And that, in many ways, is why the moment feels so heavy. Because in this institution, the louder something looks on the outside, the less real it usually is. The quieter something looks on the inside, the more it has already been decided. And what royal watchers began to piece together, line by line, room by room, was not a tabloid fantasy. It was the slow, careful, deliberate shape of a decision that had been forming for years, and that finally, just now, found its ceremony. What the public was starting to read between the lines was not that Camilla had been dragged out. It was that the geography of the monarchy, the emotional map that decides who belongs where, had begun to shift beneath everyone's feet. Windsor, the ancient royal residence that had quietly absorbed every fracture of the modern monarchy for decades, was being remapped, and when William and Catherine stood together at the heart of that remapping, in front of what looked like a simple ceremonial moment, the symbolism landed harder than any official statement could have. Because in this family, who is allowed to stand where, who is welcomed into which royal residence and for what purpose, who is given a key, who is asked to give a key back, who is invited to the private chapel before the public one, these are not logistical details, these are messages. These are the visible language of legitimacy, and right now, that language was changing. For a long time, royal observers had noticed something strange. Windsor, with its thick stone walls and its centuries of memory, had become the unspoken silent seat of the family's most private emotional decisions. It was the place where the Queen had withdrawn to grieve, the place where Charles had faced the hardest parts of his own conscience, the place where William and Catherine had taken their children to breathe when the world felt too loud. And it was also, quietly, conspicuously, the place Camilla had been allowed to settle into. Not as the dominant figure, not as the obvious political heir, but as the warm, stable, comfortable presence that the palace wanted to project after decades of chaos. For a long while that worked. The image held. The public accepted the arrangement because they had been taught to accept it. But then something began to change behind the walls. The change was not announced. It was performed. Small gestures, carefully timed arrivals, a seating chart here, a private chapel appearance there, an invitation or, more precisely, the absence of one. The kind of signals that look like nothing to a casual viewer and look like everything to someone who has spent decades learning to read the monarchy's quiet grammar. What royal watchers began to understand is that the question was no longer whether Camilla would one day be formally accepted. That had already happened, in constitutional terms, years ago. The question was something deeper, something more emotional, and something more dangerous. The question was whether the future monarchy, the monarchy that William and Catherine were already beginning to shape in practice, would allow Camilla's emotional geography to remain as wide as Charles had once needed it to be. And the answer, if you read the court language closely enough, was already forming into something the palace could not say out loud. The royal lodge arrangement at Windsor had always been the symbolic anchor of Camilla's settled position. It was not just a residence. It was a quiet declaration that Camilla had been folded into the family's inner geography. It was a place where she had hosted private events, welcomed visiting dignitaries in a softer, more domestic royal setting, and most importantly, it was a physical declaration that she belonged. For years, even when the public was uneasy, even when Diana's name still carried a moral weight that the institution could not fully erase, the Royal Lodge was there as a kind of permanent reassurance. As long as Camilla was comfortably settled there, the story the palace was telling the public was simple. Charles chose her. The institution accepted her. The family absorbed her. The future would include her as a stabilizing presence, not a contested one. This was the emotional floor to the arrangement, and for a long time, no one in the family seemed willing to disturb it. But the floor had been eroding for years, and few people outside the inner circle understood how much until now. What changed was not Charles's affection. That much, by all the patterns visible to close royal watchers, seemed intact. What changed was the architecture of the future monarchy. William's position had solidified. Catherine's moral authority within the family had grown so steadily that even her quietest gestures now carried institutional weight. And more importantly, the institutional apparatus around them, the household offices, the closest advisors, the people who planned the symbolism of the monarchy's next 50 years, had begun assembling a future structure that placed William and Catherine at its center. In that structure, every royal residence, every private room, every symbolic space, every chapel seat, every patronage list, every ceremonial role had to be reviewed. Not because anyone had launched a campaign against Camilla, but because the next reign cannot inherit the previous reign's emotional geometry without cost. And William, by every public signal, has been less willing than his father to absorb that cost. The first visible tremor came in a moment so small that most mainstream outlets barely mentioned it. A private schedule adjustment, a relocation of a household office that had long been associated with Camilla's domestic rhythm, a reassignment of a patronage that had quietly become more Camilla-coded than anyone outside the inner circle had realized. Taken individually, each of these moments would have meant almost nothing. Taken together, in the slow rhythm that the monarchy always uses to express its real decisions, they began to look like a map being redrawn. Royal watchers are trained to notice this kind of movement. They have watched Diana's era end in 1,000 small bureaucratic gestures before the final public spectacle. They watched the Queen's emotional withdrawal play out in steadily fewer public appearances and longer private retreats. They watched Charles slowly, painfully accept the limits of his own romantic inheritance. So when the same kind of movement began appearing around Camilla, the more perceptive observers did not wait for a press conference. They read the geography. And what many of them began to see, hidden in plain sight, was a slow narrowing. Not a rejection. Not yet, but a tightening. The kind of tightening that comes when a future king and his household are quietly, methodically building a palace structure in which one set of presences will be central and another set of presences will be tolerated, respected even, but spatially, emotionally, and symbolically, brought closer to the edges. And now, archival context begins to clarify what the geography had actually been signaling for years. Within the Royal Records Chamber, the archive that formalizes family recognition inside the royal institution, certain household files carry more emotional weight than others. Not because of what they write, but because of what they preserve. Access lists to private chapels, schedules that decide who attends the family's most intimate gatherings, ceremonial registers that record which consort stood where during the most private family observances. These are not glamorous documents. They do not make headlines, but they are the documents that make the monarchy a monarchy. They decide who shares the silence. They decide who stands in the morning light of a private chapel beside the family before the cameras arrive. They decide whose name appears on the entry list when the family's most protected spaces open. And what royal watchers began to understand, as fragments of these documents leaked through the slow, careful way palace information always leaks, was that the visual choreography of the family's inner life was being revised. Not rewritten, revised. There is a difference. A rewriting looks like rupture. A revision looks like refinement. But refinement, in this institution, is how power moves without anyone having to argue openly. The first private confrontation, the kind that never makes it into the newspapers, but is felt by everyone who serves inside the palace, came quietly. Those close to the inner workings of the household describe a meeting that did not raise its voice. Charles was present. William was present. Anne was present, in her typical way, not as an aggressor, but as an unblinking institutional referee. Catherine was not present in her own name. She was present through the choices the room already knew she represented. The subject on the table was not whether Camilla belonged in the family at all. That question had been settled long ago, in the formal constitutional sense. The subject on the table was the geography of the family's symbolic life, and specifically whether the royal lodge arrangement, the quiet domestic center of Camilla's emotional position, could continue to mean what it once meant in a monarchy whose emotional center was now forming itself around William and Catherine. Charles spoke with the careful restraint of a man who has spent decades navigating the impossible gap between what he wants emotionally and what the institution demands. He did not defend Camilla by attacking the room. He defended her by acknowledging the cost of what was being proposed. He knew, everyone in the room knew, that the visible decision being prepared would be read by the public and by history as a verdict on his wife. He knew that no amount of careful language would change that, so he tried to keep the language tight. He tried to keep the decision small, and yet, even as he tried, the shape of the decision was already visible. The reaction first, the one that mattered, came not from Camilla's defenders in the room. It came from William himself. William, who had spent years being measured, diplomatic, cautious, careful about his mother's memory, careful about his father's conscience, careful about the public's emotional patience, that William did not speak first. The William who spoke first was the one the family had been waiting to see. He did not attack Camilla. He did not name his mother. He did not need to. He simply stated, in the quiet institutional language that the family understands better than any other, that the next reign needed a structure that placed its central figures in the rooms that mattered. He used no anger. He used no bitterness. He used the word clarity. He said the monarchy could not afford the kind of ambiguity that turned private rooms into gossip columns. He said the public needed to see the future cleanly. He said the next reign needed to begin with a geography the public could trust. And with that, the emotional weight in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but absolutely. Because in this institution, when the future king speaks in that voice, when he speaks about clarity and trust and the public's need, the room does not challenge him. The room obeys. Anne, for her part, did not soften the moment. She has never softened institutional moments. She reassured the room, in her blunt, flinty way, that what was being proposed was not a punishment. It was a structural correction. She said, with the kind of emotional economy that her entire public life has been built on, that the monarchy had to stop allowing private comfort to distort public clarity. She said Camilla would remain the queen consort in constitutional terms. She said Camilla's formal position was untouched. But she also said, in words that those present later described with a kind of professional awe, that belonging in title is not the same as belonging in geography. And that distinction, the line between holding a place and inhabiting the emotional center of the family's future, was the line this moment was finally drawing. The minutes that followed the meeting were not dramatic. They were decisive. A new schedule was drawn up in the days that followed. Not a schedule of punishment, a schedule of placement. Camilla was not expelled from the royal lodge in any public sense. But the symbolic architecture around her was revised so carefully, so quietly, that what royal watchers read into it was unmistakable. The private chapel invitations shifted. The household responsibilities that had informally belonged to her inner circle were reassigned. The patronage list was restructured. The ceremonial pattern was recalibrated. None of this looked explosive in isolation. Together it looked like the next monarchy quietly turning its attention away from the comfort of its previous emotional arrangements and toward the figures it was preparing to crown with permanent moral authority. And now, the public is beginning to see what the decision looks like from the outside. The mainstream headlines have framed the moment almost mockingly, calling it a reshuffle, a relocation, a bureaucratic adjustment. But the more perceptive coverage has understood something different. What the public is watching is the monarchy's emotional hierarchy being redrawn in real time. Camilla's constitutional position is preserved. Her formal dignity is preserved. Her right to stand beside the king in public is preserved. But the inner architecture of the monarchy, the private gates, the chapel invitations, the rooms where grief is shared and decisions are made in the morning light before the cameras arrive, that architecture is being gently, firmly, decisively oriented around William and Catherine as the institutional center of the family's future. And once you understand that, the meaning of the title I opened with changes completely. This was never about throwing someone out. It was about realigning the family around the people the public already trusts. It was about ending an arrangement that was never quite honest and replacing it with a structure that finally tells the public the truth about where the monarchy's emotional future has already been heading. If you are watching this story unfold, you are watching a chapter of a much longer saga. This royal family has been in slow conflict with itself for years, and the more I publish these stories, the more visible that long conflict becomes. Subscribe if you want to follow this saga as it continues, because what I am seeing in the patterns suggests that what has just been decided around Windsor is going to shape every major moment of this family's next decade. The reactions across the public have fallen along exactly the emotional lines the institutional observers expected. Among long-time royal watchers in Diana's mourning generation, there is a quiet, almost tearful recognition. They see this as a delayed moral correction. They feel Diana's memory being given a small but real institutional vindication, not through revenge, not through humiliation, but through the slow reclamation of the emotional center of the family. They feel that the institution has finally accepted what they never stopped believing, that there was a difference between the woman who carried the family's emotional burden and the woman who displaced her. And they see William, who lived through that displacement as a child, finally able to express it not as a son but as a king in waiting, and they feel proud. Among Catherine's admirers, and they are legion across the Anglophone world, the moment has been read the same way. They see Catherine's composed dignity being quietly placed at the emotional center of the monarchy's future structure. They see the woman who waited, who held the family together, who never demanded recognition, finally being allowed to inhabit the role the public has always seen in her. They see the smaller, subtler signs too, the way she has begun carrying more of the family's private ceremonial weight, the way private chapels are now scheduling around her presence rather than tolerating it, the way household offices quietly adjust to her rhythms rather than the rhythms of the older generation. And on the other side of the public reaction, the defenders of Camilla have been quieter than usual. That quietness has its own meaning. It suggests that even among her supporters, there is an understanding that the institution had to do this, that the monarchy's future clarity demanded it, and that Camilla's long fight for acceptance was always going to reach a place where acceptance meant something different from centrality. Camilla has never been a cartoon figure, despite the years of caricature. She married a man whose first marriage became a national wound, and she absorbed the consequences of that wound without ever fully being allowed to heal from them. Her acceptance was slow, partial, always political. And now, even at the height of that acceptance, the institutional structure around her is being reframed so that the family's visible emotional future is not hers. That is a difficult sentence for any human being to live inside. And those who love her know it. The deeper meaning of what is happening at Windsor, the meaning that will outlast the headlines, is simple. The monarchy is moving, slowly and deliberately, toward an emotional truth the public has known for years. That truth is that Catherine has always been the family's future emotional center, not because she demanded it, not because she campaigned for it, but because her conduct earned it. She has carried grief. She has raised her children under public pressure. She has stood beside William when the family fractured and he needed someone to stand beside him. She has endured the cruelest comparisons and answered them with no comment, only conduct. And the institution, even with all its inherited caution, has finally begun to align its architecture around her. That is why the symbolic weight of what is happening inside Windsor is so heavy. This is not an eviction, this is a recognition. The monarchy is recognizing, in its quietest language, that the family's private geography belongs to the people the public trusts. And the public, for the first time in a long time, is watching the institution say something it could not say during Diana's life, could not say during the long Charles and Camilla reconstruction, and could not say in the years of uneasy compromise that followed. The public is watching the monarchy finally choose moral clarity over sentimental loyalty. If you have watched this channel for any length of time, you know I do not see these moments as entertainment. I see them as the slow public construction of a moral institution, one gesture at a time. And the moral institution being constructed now is one in which Catherine and William are the center, the monarchy's future clarity is the design, and the older arrangements are being gently but firmly carried to the side rooms where they can still be respected without being mistaken for the heart of the family. So, if you have stuck with this story this far, take a moment and tell me in the comments what you see. Did the royal family finally do what it should have done years ago? Did Camilla deserve this kind of institutional recalibration, not as punishment but as clarity? Or did Charles, who has been here before in his own life, just lose another room of his private geography to the slow moral advance of his own son? Tell me where you stand, because these moments matter, and the answers tell us where this monarchy is heading. What is left to watch now is whether Charles will accept this moment with the dignity the institution still requires of him, or whether the symbols will continue to shift until the formal language catches up with the emotional one. What is left to watch is whether Camilla will be allowed a graceful public role in the family's ceremonial life, even as her private geography narrows. What is left to watch is whether Anne's blunt institutional clarity continues to anchor the family's next decade, defending one future and pruning another. What is left to watch is whether the Royal Records Chamber, that quiet archive of family recognition, begins to record Catherine's role with the weight it has always deserved. And what is left to watch, at the deepest level, is whether the British monarchy can do what it has rarely been able to do in modern history, which is to accept that a beloved late princess was right all along, that her son's marriage was the emotional future she would have chosen for him, and that the woman now standing at the center of the family's private life is not a compromise but a continuation of the moral standard Diana quietly asked the institution to keep. That is the chapter we are inside right now. That is the silent story Windsor has been carrying. And if you want to be here for what comes next, for the next symbolic move, for the next moment when the palace tries to say something in its careful language and the public reads it in the language it actually means, subscribe to this channel and stay close. The next chapter of this royal saga will not be quiet, and you will not want to miss how the family finally speaks the truth it has been avoiding for decades.